The most expensive lie in the watch industry right now has nothing to do with fakes. It's happening inside legitimate boutiques, authorized dealers, official price lists. You're being sold the idea that newer means better, that a higher sticker equals more watch, that the industry is progressing. But that's the case, because there are 7 watches that expose the luxury market. They show how much the industry, despite all the modernity, has stalled. So, let's begin. 7 Shin 142 Lemania 5100. In October 1985, a German physicist named Reinhard Furrer strapped a watch to his wrist before boarding the Space Shuttle Challenger for the D1 mission. This watch wasn't a Rolex or an Omega. It was a Shin 142, powered by the Lemania 5100 chronograph movement. Nobody made a press release about it. The Lemania 5100 was not designed by watchmakers trying to impress collectors at Basel. It was engineered for military helicopter cockpits. The brief called for a chronograph that could survive extreme G-force, sustained vibration, magnetic interference, and temperature swings that would stop most movements cold. Lemania's answer was a movement with nylon components, specifically chosen because they were impact-resistant in ways metal parts weren't. The vertical clutch design eliminated the jerking seconds hand you get from a traditional horizontal clutch at start. And then there's the layout. A central chronograph minutes hand and central chronograph seconds hand, both reading from the center of the dial simultaneously, giving you elapsed time and running seconds in a single glance. No subdials. No hunting around the dial. Dead center, immediately legible, in darkness, in turbulence, in the kind of situations where you don't have a second look. No manufacturer in 2026 builds a chronograph like this. They build around subdials because subdials are cheaper, because the movement architecture is simpler, because consumers stopped demanding the central minute counter layout after the 5100 disappeared. And the 5100 disappeared in 2003. Not because it failed, it never failed. It disappeared because Lemania was absorbed by the Swatch Group, the tooling was retired, and the economics of producing a movement that complex for independent brands didn't pencil out. The jigs were scrapped. The specialist skills aged out. Nobody transferred the knowledge. So Shin, when they could no longer source it, switched the 142 to a Dubois Desprez-based caliber, then developed their own SZ1 in-house. Both are competent movements, but they're not aerospace engineering. The current 142 Sate 2 doesn't have the 5100 inside. It never will again. What's the 142 with the Lemania worth right now? On the secondary market, serviceable examples are trading between $2,000 and $3,500. A pristine Pre-D, one example with papers, the original H-Link bracelet, and documented service history sits above that. These prices are climbing. The watch community has been slowly realizing what it owns. The collectors who understood it 15 years ago bought everything available. The ones selling now are the ones who didn't know what they had. Consider the weight of what you're holding if you own one. An aerospace chronograph, flown in space by a working scientist, powered by a movement no longer in production anywhere on Earth. Serviceable by any competent watchmaker because the architecture is transparent and documented. There are no proprietary tools, no brand-specific software, no authorized service network requirement. Just engineering, sitting on your wrist. Sin's own service manager has said publicly that the 5100 is his favorite movement to work on. The reason isn't nostalgia. It's that the architecture has nothing to hide. The collector community on Watch You Seek has documented multiple instances of Shin 142 Lemania examples changing hands privately between enthusiasts who track each other's collections. These watches don't often reach the public market. When they do, they're gone quickly. The ones who understand them don't sell them twice. Somewhere, there's a person who sold theirs to fund something they don't remember anymore. They've been doing the math on current prices for a while now. The Shin is an extinct technology in a steel case. What comes next is a watch from Japan that proves the Swiss had competition they never fully acknowledged. 6 Grand Seiko SBGW001. Before Grand Seiko had boutiques in Paris. Before the snowflake dial became a background image on interior design accounts. Before the brand was a global talking point, there was a small group of craftspeople in Shizukuishi, Iwate Prefecture, working on a question nobody had formally asked them to answer. The question was, can we beat the Swiss at their own game? The year was 2000. The SBGW001 was Grand Seiko's first hand-wound reissue. It is a direct callback to the original 1960 Grand Seiko that had been submitted to the Besançon Observatory in Switzerland for chronometer testing and came back with scores that embarrassed several established European manufacturers. The reissue was not nostalgia. It was a statement. Here is what Japanese watchmaking looks like when the brief is excellence rather than volume. The 9S54 movement inside is manually wound, running at 28,800 vibrations per hour with a 72-hour power reserve. By raw specification, it's serious. But the specification isn't the story. The finishing is the story. Early SBGW001 examples were Zaratsu polished by hand. Zaratsu is a technique borrowed from Japanese sword polishing traditions. It is a flat zinc plate loaded with an abrasive compound, pressed against the case surface by a craftsperson applying consistent pressure and angle. Done correctly, the result is a surface with zero microconvexity, completely flat, reflective in a single plane. When light hits it, there's one reflection, not a diffusion of them. A CNC polished surface creates similar brightness, but with a gentle curvature that scatters the light slightly. The difference, on a well-lit wrist, is visible. You either know what you're looking at or you don't. In 2000, Grand Seiko applied that finishing to an entry-level piece because they were proving something. They couldn't afford to cut corners on the showpiece. The result was a watch where every facet was treated as the facet you'd look at first. My honest opinion about the SBGW001 in 2026, Grand Seiko's Micro Artist Studio makes pieces at the $80,000 level that technically exceed the SBGW001's finishing. The spring drive timepieces from the studio are the current peak, but the studio serves a different market. The SBGW001 trades on the secondary market between $3,500 and $6,000. At that price, with that finishing, in that particular era of production when everything was at stake, the value argument is not close. They were building for credibility, not for margin. Those two things produce different watches, and the difference is still on the wrist if you know how to see it. Honestly, I keep coming back to this one. There's something specific about a Grand Seiko made when the brand still had something to prove. They had this seriousness that later success tends to dull. Grand Seiko earned its reputation at $3,000. The next watch on this list spent decades being misidentified and hides the most undervalued movement in the history of dress watches. 5. Cartier Tank Basculante. Ref. 2,390. Everyone knows the Reverso, the flipping case, the Art Deco geometry, the story about polo players demanding protection from flying mallets. It's a genuine icon. It's also the obvious choice. And in watch collecting, the obvious choice is almost never the interesting one. The Basculante does something quieter and more technically interesting. The case doesn't flip, it pivots. The watch rotates within its own lugs, allowing you to turn the face inward and protect the crystal during any activity that might damage it, then rotate it outward again. It's a mechanical solution to a practical problem, engineered into a dress watch silhouette so elegant that most people who encounter it in person don't immediately understand what they're looking at. Ref. 2,390 is where it gets specific. Inside this particular Basculante sits the Frédéric Piguet Caliber 6.10, an ultra-thin manually wound movement at 5.8 millimeters total case thickness. Frédéric Piguet, operating out of Le Sentier in the Vallée de Joux, made ultra-thin movements the way other manufacturers made complicated ones. The Caliber 6.10 was a refinement of that obsession. A cam-lever escapement with the kind of surface finishing that characterizes Geneva watchmaking at its most considered. The same movement was later adopted by Blancpain, which Piguet had become part of, for pieces sold at significantly higher prices under a better-known name. In the Basculante 2390, it arrived without fanfare. Cartier marketed the watch modestly. The feature was misunderstood by many buyers, and production ended without the kind of collector frenzy that should have followed. What Cartier makes in 2026 is beautiful. The Tank Must, the Santos, the CPCP revivals, the design language remains extraordinary. But the movements inside the standard production range are competent Swiss workhorse calibers, chosen for reliability and serviceability rather than mechanical poetry. The 6.10 is mechanical poetry. There's a difference between a watch that runs accurately and a watch that was assembled as if the person assembling it expected someone to look inside one day. Secondary market prices for the 2,390 inches steel currently sit between $3,000 and $5,000. You are buying a Frédéric Piguet movement in a Cartier case for less than many people spend on stainless steel sports watches powered by baseline Swiss cylinder movements. That pricing gap only makes sense if you haven't spent time with the 2,390. Once you have, it stops making sense entirely. Which of these watches I have talked about so far do you own? Drop it in the comments. Cartier's secret was hiding in a case nobody recognized. The next watch hid something even more valuable, and its creator went on to become the most consequential watch designer of the 20th century. For Universal Genève Polarrouter. In 1954, Gérald Genta was 23 years old and not yet globally famous. His later work, the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, the Patek Philippe Nautilus, the IWC Ingenieur, would make him the default name every serious watch conversation eventually reaches. But in 1954, he was a young freelance designer handed a specific brief by Universal Genève. Scandinavian Airlines had just pioneered the commercial polar route, the first viable airline path from Los Angeles to Europe, flying over the Arctic rather than the Atlantic. It was a navigation achievement and a marketing opportunity. SAS wanted a pilot's watch that could handle cockpit magnetic fields, cold temperatures, and the kinds of conditions that northern routes produced. Universal Genève wanted a watch worthy of that story. Genta gave them the Polarrouter, and hidden inside it was a movement architecture that changed what Swiss watchmakers thought was mechanically possible. The micro rotor, caliber 215, which Universal Genève developed and patented in 1955 after settling an earlier dispute over the concept, integrated the oscillating weight directly into the movement plate rather than mounting a full-sized rotor on top. The result was a dramatically thinner movement. In the 50s, that wasn't a luxury feature. It was an engineering achievement. A steel Polarrouter in the late 50s cost approximately the same as a Rolex Explorer. These were not budget watches, they were serious ones. What happened next is the part the watch industry doesn't like to discuss. Micro-rotor movements are now a signature of haute horlogerie. Patek Philippe's micro-rotor pieces are comfortably above $20,000. Chopard's LUC Quattro runs the same concept and sits in a similar price bracket. The movement architecture that a 23-year-old Genta helped put into production in a mid-century pilot's watch is now sold as an argument for five-figure pricing at auction. Original Polarrouters with the caliber 215 can be found starting around $1,000 in decent condition, sometimes significantly less at general estate sales where the seller doesn't know what they have. Exceptional examples with tropical dials, early SAS issue references, or pristine condition push into the $3,000 and $4,000 range at specialist auction. But the base entry point for a Genta-designed watch with genuine mechanical significance remains accessible in a way that makes little rational sense given the designer's legacy. Universal Genève announced 3 new Polarrouter pieces in 2024. Not production models, unique pieces. But the signal is there. When a brand begins revisiting a reference at the unique piece level, the vintage originals get reappraised. They always do. The first crew that flew SAS's Polar route received Polarrouters directly from Universal Genève upon landing in Los Angeles. A watch designed to celebrate a navigation milestone that shrank the world, powered by a movement that quietly started a mechanical revolution, worn by the people doing the actual work. That watch can currently be yours for the price of a weekend trip. And here's what no article on the Polarrouter mentions. The cal. 215 makes a faint sound when winding on the wrist. A small, high-pitched ticking as the micro-rotor completes its arc, more audible than a standard rotor because the mass is smaller and the movement path shorter. Owners describe it as one of the few watches you can actually hear living. One collector on Dialicious wrote that it reminds me I don't have a watch like the others. In the age of ceramic and sapphire and ultra-quiet automatic movements engineered for silence, a watch that makes a small, honest sound as it winds itself is somehow remarkable. We've engineered out the evidence of the mechanism. The Polar Router never did. The Polar Router started in an Arctic cockpit. The next watch was built for the ocean floor and sold for less than a weekend at a decent hotel. 3 Seiko SKX-007. There's a paradox at the center of the SKX-007 story that gets sharper every year Seiko doesn't make it anymore. ISO 6425 is the international standard for professional diving equipment. To earn certification, a watch must survive 200 meters of water resistance with a screw-down crown, resist a defined level of magnetic interference, pass anti-shock testing equivalent to a 5-kilogram weight dropped from 1 meter, and remain legible in conditions of complete darkness. Saturation divers use equipment that meets or exceeds ISO 6425. It's professional gear certification. Seiko built the SKX-007 to that standard and sold it for approximately $200. Not inspired by dive watches. Not water-resistant to 100 meters, suitable for swimming. Actual ISO 6425 certification. The kind of specification that, if you showed the sheet to a dive equipment buyer for a commercial operation, they'd consider it adequate for professional work. Seiko wasn't doing this as a marketing exercise. It was simply how they built things in that era. The over-engineering wasn't a feature they charged for. It was just the standard. Then came 2019. Seiko discontinued the SKX line and introduced the 5 Sports SRPD as the spiritual successor. By that point, the market research was presumably clear. The vast majority of buyers wearing dive-style watches never go diving. The screw-down crown costs money to engineer. The ISO 6425 certification costs money to maintain. The water resistance rating on the SRPD dropped to 100 meters. The screw-down crown was removed. The magnetic resistance specification disappeared from the technical sheet. None of this was hidden. Seiko was transparent about the specifications. The watch still looks like a dive watch. It swims fine. For the use case of 98% of buyers, the downgrade is irrelevant. But here's the observation that collector communities on WatchUSeek and Reddit have been circling for years. The SKX-007's value proposition was never that you'd use the ISO certification. It was that a manufacturer was willing to over-engineer a $200 watch at all. That willingness revealed something about the production culture of the era. When that culture is gone, you can't recreate it by putting dive-style indices on a new model. The SKX-007 in 2026 trades on the secondary market between $250 and $450, depending on dial variant and condition. The coral and orange dial examples, produced in smaller numbers, carry a measurable premium. For any variant, you're buying a watch that would have met professional diving equipment specifications in commercial contexts. The new ones don't make that claim. They'd be wrong to. Picture the guy who bought an SKX-007 in 2013 as his first real watch. Wore it hard for 4 years. Sold it when he moved up to something more impressive. Got $120 for it at a local shop. He's thought about that transaction approximately 400 times since. But here's the more interesting version of this story. There's also the person who bought an SKX-007 in 2016, didn't know what it was, wore it because it looked right, and still has it. They've never looked up the current secondary market value. They don't know they own a certified piece of professional diving equipment that Seiko no longer makes. They just know it hasn't let them down. That person is, accidentally, a collector. The watch chose them rather than the other way around. Those are often the best collections. Seiko was over-engineering watches nobody asked for. Omega was building the watch everyone asked for, and then engineered the new version to prefer its own service network. 2 Omega Speedmaster Professional, referent 3570.5. The Moonwatch has been on the wrist of every NASA astronaut since 1965. That story is true. It's been told 10,000 times. It's also not the reason the 3570.50 belongs on this list. The reason is what Omega did to the Moonwatch afterward. Ref. 3,570.50 runs, caliber 1,861, a direct descendant of the original caliber 321 that went to the Moon, simplified for long-term production. The 1,861 is a manually wound, column wheel chronograph with cam-actuated levers and a horizontal clutch. Its failure modes are documented across decades of service records. Every independent watchmaker who works on vintage watches has encountered the 1,861 or something close enough to it. You can get it serviced competently in Nairobi, in Oslo, in a strip mall in suburban Ohio. The parts circulate freely. The movement asks nothing of you except the standard care you'd give any mechanical watch. The current Moonwatch runs caliber 3,861, and by objective specification, it's a superior movement, coaxial escapement, master chronometer certified. Anti-magnetic to 15,000 Gauss, which means it can sit next to your phone, your laptop, and most MRI machines without the rate shifting. Silicon parts in the escapement that don't need lubrication on the same schedule as metal. These are real improvements. But here's what Omega doesn't advertise on the display card in the boutique. The 3,861 moved the dial feet positions, changed the subdial spacing, requires Omega-specific silicon tools for certain service operations that the 1,861 didn't need. An independent watchmaker working on a 3,861 is working slightly outside the intended service environment. Not impossible, but Omega's preference is clear. They'd prefer you brought it back to the network. Every engineering choice in the 3,861 is defensible on technical grounds. But several of them also happen to make the authorized service center more important to the owner's experience than the 1,861 ever did. The 1,861 doesn't care where you take it. That's not a limitation. That's the product of being built before boutique-only serviceability was a business model. A pre-owned 3,570.50 inches, excellent condition, with box and papers, currently trades between $2,800 and $4,000. The 2026 Moonwatch Master Chronometer lists new at approximately $7,000 if you can find one at retail without a wait list, which varies by market. On the gray market, the premium is real. You're paying somewhere around $3,000 extra for the newer movement. Some of that buys you genuine technical improvement. Some of it buys you a watch that prefers its own service network. Omega's authorized service on a modern Speedmaster is currently running between $800 and $1,200 in most markets. Independent watchmakers who will touch the 1,861 do it for considerably less, because the movement is known, the parts are available, and the time spent is predictable. The 3,861 changes that calculation. It's not impossible to service independently, it's just not what the engineering anticipated. The 3,570.50 has no such preference. It was built when the assumption was that the person who owned it would take care of it, wherever they happened to be, with whoever was the best watchmaker available to them. That assumption produced a different kind of object than the one being built now. The Speedmaster was built to last indefinitely. The watch at number 1 was built to the same standard, and then its manufacturer found a quiet way to make you need a new one anyway. 1 Rolex GMT Master 2, Ref. 16710. Let's start with the bezel, because that's where the story actually lives. The 16710 was offered in 3 bezel configurations: Pepsi, Coke, and all black. The inserts were aluminum. You could buy them individually, swap them yourself with a basic tool in 5 minutes, and run any combination you wanted on any given day. More than that, aluminum ages. The red on a Pepsi fades toward a particular shade of orange after years of UV exposure and wear. Collectors on forums have spent years documenting the exact production windows that produce the most sought-after fade characteristics. There's a specific batch of late production 16710 Pepsi bezels from the early 2000s where the blue holds steady while the red drifts into a salmon tone that makes the watch look like nothing else on Earth. That happened because aluminum ages in conversation with its owner. It's not a defect, it's character developing in real time. The 126710, introduced in 2018 with its ceramic Cerachrom bezel, solved a genuine problem. Ceramic doesn't fade, it doesn't scratch. It will look identical in 40 years. Rolex solved impermanence and, in doing so, ended individuality. And because the ceramic processing required to achieve bicolor bezels is proprietary, you can no longer swap bezel colors on a 126710. Want Coke instead of Pepsi? You're buying another watch. The customization that was a standard feature of the 16710 is now, structurally, a reason to own 3 separate references. Whether that was intentional is a question nobody at Rolex will answer on the record. The case geometry difference between the 2 references is real but more nuanced than some forum posts suggest. The 16710 measures 12 millimeters tall. Its predecessor generation, the 16710, ran closer to 13. The 126710 continues that trajectory with broader lugs, bigger crown guards, and a more substantial presence on the wrist. Comparing photographs, the modern watch looks more powerful. Comparing the wrists they sit on, the 16710 disappears in a way the 126710 doesn't. The caliber 3185 inside the 16710 gives you independent hour-hand adjustment, traveling through time zones without stopping the movement. That function carried forward into the 3285 inches, the 126710. Both movements are exceptional, but the 3185 has been in the field since the early 90s. Its failure modes are cataloged. Parts are in circulation. Any serious Rolex specialist can work on it confidently. The 3285, newer and more technically refined, is also less understood outside Rolex's own service infrastructure. That gap will close over time. It hasn't yet. On the secondary market right now, a clean 16,710 inches, excellent condition with matching bracelet and good dial trade between $6,000 and $10,000, depending heavily on bezel condition, dial variant, and whether it comes with original box and papers. An all-black with faded T-Swiss dial and a worn oyster bracelet is at one end of that range. You're paying around the same amount for a watch that offers you fewer configuration options, a heavier wrist presence, and a bezel that won't age. Here's the observation I keep returning to with the 16710. It wasn't rare when it was made. Rolex produced it for roughly 2 decades across the late 80s to mid-2000s. Hundreds of thousands exist. This isn't a limited piece or a special reference. It was a working watch, sold to travelers and professionals and enthusiasts who needed a tool. And then the era ended quietly. No final production ceremony, no farewell edition. The materials changed. The serviceability assumptions shifted. The customization window closed without announcement. There's a 16710 Pepsi somewhere right now with a faded bezel that developed its particular tone over 15 years of wrist time in outdoor conditions. No two fade exactly alike. The aluminum insert recorded something about the life of the person who wore it. UV exposure from specific places, specific activities, specific years. The ceramic Cerachrom on the 16710 will never do that. It will look the same the day it's retired as it did the day it shipped. That's not a failure. It's a design choice. But it means the 16710 can never become the watch that the 16710 can become with time. One watch is a finished object. The other was still in progress. And the people who sold theirs have been doing arithmetic ever since. None of these 7 watches were mysteries when they were made. Nobody was hiding them. They were just good, built at a moment when the question was, does this work? Rather than, how do we justify the price? That question has a shorter shelf life than it used to. The industry runs on a different logic now, the boutique experience, the certification network. The material that won't age, won't fade, won't develop the kind of character that can't be manufactured on demand. The movement that nudges you back toward the authorized service center. These aren't conspiracies, they're business models, and they produce different watches than the ones on this list. What they can't replicate is the era. You cannot commission a new SKX 007 in 2026. Seiko could make a watch with a screw-down crown and a 100-meter rating and call it a spiritual successor, and it would miss the point. The point wasn't the spec sheet. The point was a production culture that considered over-engineering the default. That culture is gone from those price points. It's gone from most price points. Same with the Lemania 5100, same with the FP 6.10 inches the Basculante, same with the Genta micro rotor in its original production context. The knowledge exists. The will to use it at accessible prices doesn't. Which means the watches that already have those things inside them are, right now, undervalued relative to what they represent. Not collectible market undervalued, genuinely undervalued by people who use them every day without realizing the era they're wearing on their wrist. What the industry is hoping you don't notice is that the best version of some of these watches already existed, and you might be holding it. If this list reminded you of something you have, or helped you understand something you own, tell me in the comments which one it is. I'm genuinely curious which of these 7 has the most owners who didn't fully know what they had. And if you want to keep going, the channel is there. Like and hit subscribe. There are more of these conversations coming.